So welcome back everybody to another webinar organized from Princeton for everyone worldwide. We're very happy to have Adam Posen with us. Hi, Adam. Great, Adam, to have you with us. Adam will talk about international economic challenges for the president-elect Joe Biden, about trade, China, the dollar, and the pandemic recovery. And we're looking forward to get his perspective. I would like to give you some few introductory remarks, what the challenges are, and would like to talk a little bit about globalization we have talked earlier about. And the important thing I would like to stress first is about successes of globalization. So if you look back, since human mankind existed, it took about 10,000 years to reach 4 billion people in global population. And it took from the 1975 till to roughly today, another 4 billion on Earth. So essentially the population growth is just phenomenal, how dramatic it is growing in the last 50 years. It took 10,000 years for the first billion, another 50 years for the next 4 billion. And at the same time, there was poverty reduction, dramatic poverty reduction across the globe. So it's in a sense, if you live from a perspective of the 1970s, it's really almost a miracle how well the economy did and how well we could reduce poverty given the population growth we are facing. Then you see in this chart, you see this huge decline, especially in Asia, in the Southeast Asia, the huge decline in poverty rates. And I think that's, a huge degree of this success is due to globalization. And that's the challenges we face. We would like to keep this going and keep actually poverty reduction going on. So what are the challenges, the tensions with respect to globalization? I just associate them with different names based on earlier webinar presentations. Of course, we have some internal tensions. That's inequality, insecurity. Agnes Deaton was talking very early on about these internal tensions we face because of globalizations. Then we have some divergences in preferences. So different regions have different preferences in terms of food. You think of the different treatment of chickens and also forth. Privacy considerations becomes more and more important. And then we have environmental considerations which become very, very different across regions. And Danny Roderick was talking, is referring to these aspects quite a lot. Then we had the China shock, David Author's China shock, in a sense that you had this expectation that, opening up towards China will be a disruption, but it will be a process, a slow moving process, and it will be diffused because of a well-functioning labor market. That were the expectations, but the realization was that disruption was much more fast and concentrated, and it was difficult to adjust and cope with the adjustment. So that's the China shock. And then we have, of course, the whole technology issue, intellectual property rights protection and so forth. And we have the tensions with international institutions, whether certain international institutions are they still effective or not in terms of, having new negotiations and trading deals or trade rounds, and how to make conflict resolutions possible. And of course, the Trump administration was not helpful on this. And the question is how to revive these institutions. And in particular, in the light that certain developing countries don't have any obligations, and China is counted as a developing country within the WTO as well. So these are all challenges. And we have seen earlier with Stephen Redding that we had this globalization phenomenon. So globalization is still ongoing, just stabilizing, and it's not such a big dramatic thing. While the chief economist of the World Bank argued that COVID is the last nail in the coffin of the globalization. And so there are different tensions, and the question is what will prevail, and we will learn from Adam some aspects to add to this list. So the 21st century is, of course, characterized by huge interdependencies. And what's encouraging is that despite the COVID, the borders stayed pretty much open in terms of goods flow and other flows. So that's actually very good. And we also face huge public goods provisions at the international level. Just think of climate change, think of the health. These are probably the dominating factors. And then it becomes the importance of networks. So having a huge network, whether it's social network, other networks, the scale becomes way, way more important. That also speaks for having bigger areas rather than having small countries dealing on their own. The weaponization of networks and the scale that actually having a network gives you a huge power in a sense. And that has also important implications for geopolitics and US-China relationships. And, the question will be how we will integrate this in a bigger picture. Now, the choices for the US and for Europe, essentially, and for China, the first question is, what's about the US-China relationship? Can we still rescue a one world with multilateralism, that we have actually one world all living together, or will it be very much a bipolar world where China will reach the self-sufficiency as they outlined in their plan 2025, and there will be regional zones around it and the fight for regional influence? Or will it be that we have a conflict and cooperate? So in certain areas we will cooperate a lot, in other areas there will be conflict. You know, take technology, there might be more conflict. Climate change, there might be more cooperation. So how will it play out? We will try to learn something along these dimensions as well. And then what is the role between US and Europe? And you saw from Adam's questions, we will get the answers very soon. That's already some aspects. Is the US prepared to agree with European standards, and are the Europeans prepared to agree with US standards? Can there be a compromise or common ground on climate? Could there be a transatlantic financial area, or on privacy and data issue, which is becoming more and more important issue, and also on the food standards? All of these are important areas to touch upon. And of course, in the US, the power on these issues is not really with the president, it's more with the US Congress, and that makes, of course, the whole situation more difficult to negotiate. And the question is, you know, what choice should Europe take? Should it be a stalwart of multilateralism, or should it, you know, focus, you know, very much on the one world idea, or should it focus more on transatlantic focus? Where should Europe position itself? And from a US perspective and from a European perspective, that's very, very interesting. And these are the big questions of our times to some extent. And hopefully Adam will shed some light on it. Of course, we will not be able to answer these questions at this point. Now, but we want to know what you answered to the questions Adam proposed in his poll. And let me just give you the summary to the questions, the way you responded to them. The first question was, is the declining net international investment position of the US concerning? And about 25% think yes, a lot. And 55% think yes, a little, and not concerned about 20%. Okay, that's about 25, 55, 20. So people are concerned, the majority is concerned. Should the US decouple the West's high-tech sector from China? Yes, very urgently, only 3% said yes, selectively 54%. So the majority says yes, but selectively no's at 32%, and no, we should increase technological interactions with China, 12% claim that. Now the third question is like, will the US join the CPTPP or whatever the successor will be for the Pacific region, some trade area, or the trade agreement with the European Union by 2025? Yes, the CPTPP, that's about 20% said. Yes, whatever, you know, the US deal will be at that time is about 40%, and both 20% and neither 20%. So it's 20, 40, 20, 20. I rounded the number a little bit. And the fourth question, again, a very interesting question, again, is the impact of the rising EU standards with respect to environmental standards, in particular, tax on carbons and so forth. How will it impact the US? Will it lead to a rising US standards? The price of carbon in the US is going up too. That's actually what 56% think. On the other hand, 28% thought it will lead to a free riding by the US, and later on, it might lead to a raising standards in the US as well. And only 6% think actually border adjustment tax and all these things will provoke a trade war. So that's a very small number thinking that it provoke a trade war. And the fourth option was a trade war, then a rise in US standards. That's about 10%. So the last two up together is about 16%. So with this picture to Adam's questions, we open the floor to Adam. He can give us his perspective, and perhaps we come to different answers after we have listened to his perspective. So Adam, the floor is yours, and great to have you on.
Thank you so much, Markus. You and the Markus Academy and the Benheim Center have been doing a real service, and it's actually a very honor big honor for me to be following the footsteps in this series of many friends and people I've learned so much from through the years. You did a great job of reminding us all that globalization is on balance and overwhelmingly for the poor of the world a good thing. And that I want to take as writ. And so the question is then, knowing that, what do we think the US administration, the next US administration, the incoming US administration is going to do? What should they do? And so I'm not trying to give a pure forecast here, but I am trying to set out what we know about the constraints in practice that the Biden administration will face, what they've said so far, and try to give a picture of some of these issues. Like you said, Marcus, none of these issues are going to go away or be resolved, but there are better and worse ways of dealing with them. And along the way, I hope to talk a bit about the damage that was wrought in the area of international economic policy by the Trump administration's policy choices. How persistent is that damage? How does it affect whether Europe or China or others can cooperate with the US or can rely on the US? And so I think there's a rich set of issues here. I'm very grateful to my colleagues at the Peterson Institute for International Economics who do a bunch of great empirical work and policy work on these issues. And you'll see some of the fruits of that and references to that in my talk. And I hope that you'll all use that as a resource for your teaching as well as your public discussion. Let me try to share screen now. Okay, share, great. So the first thing that people have to wake up to is that US presidents rarely want to focus on foreign policy in their first year in office. And international economics is even lower in the priorities than that. And Trump coming in with a very strong agenda and motivation on international economics was a historical exception. There are famous stories about Bill Clinton appointing William Christopher to be his Secretary of State and saying, keep all the economics and international off my desk. And then that was interrupted, of course, by the Mexican crisis. But when we think about what are the priorities, the state priorities of the president-elect's economics team, including your Princeton colleague, Cecilia Rouse, who's coming in as chair of the CEA, the focus is on raising the incomes of working people, recovery from the pandemic, and economic aspects of what we'll call justice. And none of these sound directly international economic, or at least not priority. But even if the US is disinterested, these are policy decisions. If you just choose not to do something, there are several issues, including notably US-China relations, but also trade, where a non-decision by the US does have repercussions. I also want to point out, coming from a central banking background, that there are still some areas where technocratic management has continued, and central banking and financial supervision has been one of the areas where successful international cooperation has gone on relatively unimpeded in the last several years, and arguably better now than it was before the global financial crisis. So it's not all one uniform picture. But what I would like to stress, and what I've tried to communicate to people I know going in or advising the Biden administration, is that many of the most significant issues for the US economy are inescapably international. Obviously, vaccine distribution and the future of pandemic management, climate change, but we have to also consider issues of food and water security around the world, the regulation and supervision of digital industries. You all are aware of the Facebook decision or case announced yesterday. Financial stability, obviously spillovers back and forth, as Markus has contributed so much on the topic. Adequate funding of government revenues, dealing with tax evasion, base erosion, profit shifting, and of course, conflict with China. There are other issues that are very important to the Biden administration, I think arguably rightly important to the US, but which have an international aspect that can be helped by international economic policy. The simultaneous slowdown in productivity growth we've seen across the rich world, what Larry Summers has termed secular stagnation, the persistent unemployment and maybe some scarring of labor force that we're seeing as a result of the pandemic, issues of racial and gender inequality that are in fact affected by international scrutiny and international standards, and of course, poverty in the low and middle income economies of the world. So what are the constraints? If Biden was well-intended and they wanted to listen to people on this call, we could give them a laundry list, but there are of course political constraints on economic policymaking in the US. The most important is the divided electorate and the divided Congress. Markus stressed this in his opening intro, and I think it does matter a great deal. Now, the ability of the president to make executive orders is very great, but on certain issues, including on trade. But anything that requires a tax change or a treaty is, of course, dedicated to Congress's mandate. And so it's not an easy thing to get passed. I think it's also a reality right now that there's bipartisan fear, and I would say excessive bipartisan fear, of threat from Chinese leadership. And I mean Chinese leadership in two senses. I mean the actions of the current Chinese leadership and the prospect of Chinese leadership in the international system. And I say excessive not because I have any belief that the lead people of the Chinese Communist Party leadership have good intentions, but more just because I think their ability to threaten others is more outside their borders, is much more limited than many of our Congress people think. But this is a political constraint, that there is this almost red fear, like in the 50s. Of course, as people at Princeton, like Avinash Dixit and Gene Grossman and many others have written about, we have the usual special interest lobbying to defend sectoral privileges. I think another thing that is important is we've had a significant loss of reputational soft power by the US, and this has been intensified by our self-harming response compared to other countries, and not just China, compared to other democracies in East Asia and in the Pacific, like Australia and New Zealand, our self-harm in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And then, of course, there's a legacy directly of Trump administration economic policies, the tariffs, the rhetorical escalation versus China, increasing distrust abroad of the ability of the US government to make a commitment and live up to it. We've had, and this sounds like a very Washington thing, but it's very important, we've had an extreme politicization and diminution of the US civil service, critically in places like State Department, Treasury, various agencies. And there's a whole list of executive orders that Trump made, many of which, at least on paper, President-elect Biden can reverse as fast as he can move his pen. But some of them will be contested by and protected by the courts. On the other hand, we shouldn't assume too much. Sorry, Markus, you want to interrupt?
Yeah, there's a question by David Ballard. He would like to know that you mentioned that the domestic agenda is at the priority, but Trump used the international arena to influence the domestic agenda. Do you see something like this coming up in the Joe Biden administration as well?
It's a good question. I think there are ways they could constructively do that, and I offer a couple suggestions at the very end of the talk, but I don't expect them to do that anywhere near as much as the Trump administration did. I think they're going to be more responsible and evidence-based, which partly constrains them, but I also think politically, and this isn't my expertise, but politically, there's going to be a feeling of wanting to respond directly to the domestic issues like Black Lives Matter, like the pandemic, face on, rather than talking about the international aspect. But that's just a guess on my part. I do want to, in that spirit, suggest there are some things that are overhyped or exaggerated as constraints, political constraints in US economic policy making. And so there is a long litany of people talking about the popular opinion against trade. I'm not going to go through it right now, but the public opinion data is highly unreliable and unstable on this. But to the degree we have data, it mostly has seen an increase in support for globalization and trade in the US in recent years. And this narrative about angered losers from trade, I think, is false. Not that there aren't people harmed by trade, as we discussed with the China shock, but because that isn't what maps into who votes which way. We saw this in Brexit. We've seen this in the US. There's a very nice piece by Thomas Edsall in the New York Times Online today, pulling together a lot of the recent political science and sociology literature on the issue of status rather than loss. You also will occasionally, though not as much recently, get calls that there should be some centralized authority for competitiveness or foreign economic policy. That institutional capacity is not a constraint in my view, and history demonstrates that. There is another sense in which people argue you can have a special interest that through its power over Congress sort of vetoes international negotiations. And I think this is meaningful drag, but not a constraint. We saw the revision of NAFTA into USMCA, which was a mixed bag normatively, but in positive terms, they were able to get labor on board, the organized labor in the US, which has been traditionally anti-trade for a very strong extent, with some very targeted side payments in terms of enforcement of labor rules. Distrust of technocratic policymaking exists, but again, I don't think that's as widely held in the country as it was in the Trump administration. And the fact that the Fed got away with doing its swap lines and everything like that in a world where people were distrusting the doctors telling them about the pandemic tells you that it's not so simple to just say there's distrust of experts. And finally, as Jason Furman spoke about in this series a couple weeks back, and others have spoken about, the fiscal limits and financial markets are not that big a constraint on what the US can do in this sphere. So another perspective I want to talk about is just that globalization is about more than stuff you can drop on your foot or stuff you can eat. What the media tends to focus on is big public works projects. Do you buy American? Who builds them? Steel production, steel overproduction, auto tariffs, fishing. Of course, fishing is a Brexit issue as much as a US issue, but the US is there. And even economists tend to focus on, I think, excessively on these time series of what is the volume of trade or on global value chains. There are important discussions to be had here. You had Stephen Redding recently talk on globalization in this series. My colleague Mary Lovely has done important work on global value chains. But the focus of thinking about globalization in terms of these disputes over stuff and just is trade going up or down, I think is quite misleading. Instead, I would like to think of globalization as a multi-layered web of connections. The trade in goods is only a smallish and maybe the most resilient part of this, that its flows of investment of ideas, of services, of human capital, norms, that's what really counts in this matter. And so economic openness isn't just about opening markets or about who you have access to, it's about the beneficial effect it has on a society by providing competition, new ideas, diversity. And this, of course, also goes with issues of variety and opportunity that others have worked on. That doesn't make me reassured. I mean, globalization has, in my view, been corroding for roughly the last 15 years. It's becoming more frayed, uneven, but it's not simply retreating or advancing. We're seeing CPTPP or RCEP, these trade deals in Asia, go forward. We're seeing deepening integration in Europe on the financial side and the fiscal side. It's not all or nothing. But what I argued a few years ago in Foreign Affairs seems to have been borne out, that the post-American world economy, we've got more unevenness of globalization. It's less fairly and rules-based applied, and therefore more uncertainty. And so part of the macroeconomic volatility and declining performance we've seen in the rich world over the last 15 years, I think has to be seen as in a two-way causality with the retreat of globalization, that it makes some of the economic performance worse, and some of the worsening economic performance increases political hostility to globalization. Markus, you can interrupt at any time if you want to pose a question, obviously. So in terms of the Trump administration, I'm not going to beat a dead horse, and it is a dead horse no matter how many court cases they file. But in terms of straight up trade policy, the Trump administration, we have to say it again and again. Their policy had it pretty much the result the economic textbooks would have said would happen. Tariffs were put on, they were paid for by the American consumer, the work of a median or co-authors, Goldberg and her co-authors, various studies by my colleagues at PIE have all documented this. The trade deficit kept increasing, even though Trump made that a target due to the fiscal dissaving, and the tariffs didn't really have any effect. Unilateral sanctions and threats tended to just divert trade from the US. A great example of this, which Chad Bown illustrated, is what happened with lobster. You had this tariffs put on, and so the Chinese were blocking US lobster coming in. And so they suddenly liberalized Canadian lobster, and the Canadians gained all the market share that the Americans had. And again, with all due respect to my friends in Maine, I don't really care from a policy perspective what happens to American lobster, but just as an illustration, this is the kind of thing that happens. And my colleague Sherman Robinson has documented how trade patterns have evolved very rapidly in response to the US tariffs, including in developing countries. Volume of trade has not been that much affected. And of course, internally in the US, one second, Markus, internally in the US, corruption and, as the political economy would tell you, these cascades of protection grew, where one firm being protected would seek to get another firm protected. Please go ahead.
So you're saying essentially focusing on the goods is actually misguided. So what people argue, if you look at the goods that in the, there was an explosion of globalization of trade, but then it stabilized. So it was essentially a globalization rather than a decline. But you had on your slides early on that actually in the last 15 years, there's a retreat from globalization. Would you argue it's because we measure globalization the wrong way? We focus too much on goods trading when we measure it, and there's actually really a decline rather than just a stabilization at a high level.
Actually, I basically agree with your characterization that I think we do maybe not measure globalization the wrong way, but because the data is available and because it seems so intuitive and political, we overweight the trading goods and we ignore these other dimensions. And so it's not so much that there's been a decline versus the globalization. It's more that there's been, I use the term erosion or fragmentation, that in certain areas, you've seen an increase. There have been certain areas, particularly in trade, where trade is liberalized. There are other areas where relationships have gotten cut off or broken down. It's just that it used to be that many of these things would go together. And sort of the global glory days from 1989 to say 2004, in the US, you had trade and financial markets and flows of people and flows of R&D and investment and cultural capital. They all sort of went together and were broadening in a relatively aligned fashion. And that, I think, is what gets missed now, that's not what's happening. And the globalization is important of view of trade. And that's right, the trade hasn't retreated, but it's not capturing to me the full phenomenon. Thank you for underlining that. And so this chart, this is the first of 4 charts from my colleague Simeon Jankov, who's leading an effort at Peterson to document how globalization along different dimensions is or is not retreating. And we'll be posting a bunch of these starting in January. And this is one of them. It's an interesting comparison of the percent of trade in world GDP and then the percent of trade in US GDP. And obviously there's a huge dip around the global financial crisis, but the US has continued to globalize at a much slower rate than the rest of the world after starting more closed than most other countries. And so the gap between the share of GDP and trade is getting wider and wider between the US experience and the rest of the world. Foreign direct investment, which brings with it some of the most important transfers of technology, knowledge, jobs, returns, has been cutting down. The direct foreign investment flows in the US are down despite a major US corporate tax cut meant to bring them up, and despite until through 2019, a strong economy. Of course, this is heavily influenced by individual decisions and large transactions. But on the second panel, you look at greenfield expenditures, and that's been steadily declining. The US is losing to some degree its attractiveness as a destination for foreign direct investment, and that predates Trump, to be fair. Third, obviously, immigration is a critical issue politically, and that is part of what I think Markus was referring to when he talks about Trump bringing the international economics home. And what we've seen is that the government can make a huge difference in the extent of immigration without any change in legislation, depending how they enforce the law and the climate they create. And so we've seen an enormous decline in US immigration prior to the pandemic. But it's also important to notice that a lot of the hostility to foreigners and a lot of the racial hostility hasn't mitigated as a result of this declining immigration. It's been a proxy for something else. And then looking at something which many on this call are all too aware of, and many at Princeton are all too aware of, which is the incredibly sharp decline of foreign student enrollment. And we just saw outgoing Secretary of State Pompeo make another call or attempt to force universities to cut off enrollment of Chinese students. And this is one of the places where I think of excessive anti-Chinese feeling in the Congress. We have people from both parties arguing for limiting Chinese students in the US, believing them all to be spies in some sense. And I think this is exaggerated, to put it mildly. But again, these are a bunch of ways in which the US is unraveling its ties to the rest of the world, or did over Trump's term. And it's a question of how much does the president-elect wish to change this?
Do you think, is this a decision by the president himself, or Or does the Congress has to be involved in this?
Well, so the key point, which I've tried to make and which I will repeat and try to make more explicit, is that an enormous amount of power over these kinds of decisions, including immigration, including not as much FDI, but including student roles and tariffs, is done through the president's executive authority. Our colleague in Peterson, Gary Huffbauer, warned about this in September 2016, that the president could do things enormously through just arbitrary authority without Congress. And so essentially everything that's happened on trade and immigration, and for that matter, environmental regulation, over the last 4 years has been done by the president through executive order. There's been almost no legislation passed in Congress. And again, to be fair, this is a long-standing pattern. Because Congress tends to be deadlocked, because Congress has tended not to pass things, the first Bush and Cheney, then Obama, and then Trump, each in succession have relied heavily on executive orders. Obama, particularly in the second term when the Republican Senate refused to pass what he did. And so a lot of this is up to the president. Now, as you, I'm sure, recognize, Markus, and most of this audience recognizes, having government policies be arbitrarily set and perhaps go 180 degrees one way or the other every 4 years is not an ideal environment for long-term planning, investment, international agreements. So even if Biden comes in and reverses all these things, and on environment, frankly, and energy, I expect him to reverse almost all of them quickly. On immigration, I expect him to reverse many of them. On some of the worst trade, like the national security pretend tariffs on Europe, I expect him to reverse it. But that's not as good as getting something through Congress legislated. And both legitimacy and permanence, or permanence is not quite the right word, but persistence, dependability. Just a short detour on manufacturing, because one thing that President-elect Biden has shared rhetorically with President Trump is an emphasis on US manufacturing, with all these, glory images of large men moving stuff and doing dangerous jobs. And I'm not saying that just to be cute. I think the toxic masculinity that has permeated various other aspects of public policy permeates the fetish of manufacturing. But anyway, as my colleague Robert Lawrence has been documenting, and he has a manuscript forthcoming for us early in the new year, the decline of manufacturing jobs in the US has been a very long-term process. And you can talk about the China shock, but as a percent of employment, it's just, you don't see the China shock there. There's no abrupt shift. It's just an ongoing long technological process. And if you look across countries, even those countries that in a sense bore the China shock better, that they had trade surpluses on an ongoing basis, including Germany, including Korea, they also saw pretty significant declines in manufacturing employment over the last several decades. Again, this is calculated by Robert Lawrence. This is just more detail meant to tantalize people. So there is an interesting question when President-elect Biden talks about this kind of manufacturing emphasis and says he wants to continue the Buy American policies, which are basically preferences for protecting American producers, domestic producers in procurement. Is it going to work? It's not going to work, and it is costly. This is an analysis by my colleagues Gary Huffbauer and Eugene Jung, looking at the costs of markup on domestic procurement, and it's significant. It's significant. Now, it may be worse in the EU, as they're showing here, but in the US, 94 billion is real money still. And it looks like Biden administration may continue this.
So just to come back to this chart,
yeah.
So you're saying that the US citizens have to pay 94 billion more because of these restrictions?
For the same product, absolutely. And that probably slightly understates it, because then you get into issues of, how quality and are you getting the right or the best thing in an environment where you're reducing competition, in addition to the direct costs of the markup. It's just like trade protection in any other field. I just throw this up here because one has to point out that this is one specific aspect of trade protection that the Biden administration has made very clear, at least initially, they don't intend to change. And that, along with the studies I already cited by numerous scholars, this is costly, just like other tariffs have been costly.
And these are the numbers in 2017, so it's
a couple.
In Trump, they probably went up recently.
It probably did. It may have gone down slightly in the EU because there's been some greater integration, a little bit breakdown on bidding. In the US, it's probably gone up. I'll have to double check if my colleagues have more recent numbers, but the order of magnitude, it shouldn't have changed that much because absent a massive infrastructure push, the amount of domestic government procurement tends to be relatively stable. Another issue, just to remind people of the resources, this is some incredible work done by my colleague Chad Bown at Peterson and colleagues, tracking what happened with China's trade. And again, for an economist audience, this doesn't surprise you, but it's worth documenting. So China and the US agreed what they called their phase one trade deal. And this was extremely interventionist with targeted goals from the US side, that they wanted specific purchase agreements from China on various types of goods, as well as various types of behaviors. And what has happened is that the commitments have come nowhere close to being fulfilled. And even prior to the pandemic, they were coming nowhere close to being fulfilled. Even in, say, energy, where it looked like there was an easy get, where the Chinese government could, to some degree, direct purchases. And so it's just a reminder that, in a sense, the trade is more resilient than we think, that very managed trade, when advocated by the US, is not generally likely to work. And so one hears a lot, if you live in Washington, about decoupling, which is why I put that as one of the polling questions. It was very interesting to hear the range of responses from people. But I had spoken narrowly in that polling question about high-tech decoupling, because I think that's the place where there is a legitimate debate to be had. But there are people in the Trump administration, but also in the Congress, including both parties, who want to have a broader decoupling of the US and China, and China's new 5-year plan has some rhetoric about increasing self-reliance at the same time that it has rhetoric about international opening. My colleagues Nick Lardy and Tianwei Huang are looking at that. This is just a chart from some work that Nick pulled out from People's Bank of China data. And what we've seen is, despite this talk of decoupling in the US, from the US end, despite the financial sanctions the US has tried to use, the amount of foreign portfolio investment in China has continued to rise. And this is continuing. You can use other measures of financial integration. They're not quite as stark, but they all trend in the same direction. And so this decoupling effort on the broad scale doesn't seem to be working, again, even if you agree on the goal. This chart is intentionally confusing. I don't mean that it's meant to be confusing. I mean that on the slide, obviously no one can read it. This is from work done by my colleague Martin Strzempa, trying to track what's going to be the new process on the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US, which now has enormously widened remit to review Chinese and foreign investment in the US. And again, I encourage you to go to the website and look at the details, but the basic idea is this is not a simple determination. This is a complicated, costly process. And similarly, the US has now been trying to restrict, US government has been trying to restrict the infamous firm Huawei's access to semiconductors. I say infamous, ironically. And again, this may be a legitimate goal of policy. I'm not sure it is, but it may be perfectly fine. But implementing it is non-trivial because there's been such integration of the global supply chain in the semiconductor industry, US and foreign, to the benefit of the technology. And so unwinding this is extremely difficult.
Do you see already some unwinding in the last 4 years going on? Is there any way to quantify that? To say, okay.
Mary Lovely and Martin Strzempa at our shop are trying to work on it. And I know some of the other people you've had in the series are trying to work on it. What's been an interesting surprise is a lot of the biggest multinational companies, they didn't even really sort of track or think about how complex their value chains got. it sort of grew up organically. It was not a very top-down decision. And so when they're forced to unwind it or reconsider it, it turns out to be a complex process. We've tried asking corporate friends, can you share with us confidentially data? And it turns out even just getting data from them, not totally confidentially, just for research, it turns out to be very difficult. They don't really know. Again, Sherman Robinson has done some work on this as well. And what we're seeing, to the degree I can discern a trend, Marcus, and try to forecast, what we've seen is building redundancy of supply chains. So we've seen people building additional capacity in countries outside China or outside the US, aimed at those markets and aimed at other markets. And so there's some things going up in Vietnam and Mexico that are duplicates of supply chains that we used to have in, say, China or Hong Kong.
Is it this, so dual sourcing, if you compare, one option is to reshore, to bring it back to the US. Another option is to bring it out of China in some other country, like what you mentioned, is dual or multi-sourcing. Do you see that you stay in the same continent, or you move then totally to Latin America to have really some resilience if something happens?
What we're seeing so far, it's a very good question. What we're seeing so far is primarily things are staying put, but to the degree we're seeing movement, it is making duplication across regions. So to some degree, it's Vietnam. I'm picking Vietnam and Mexico, not just illustratively, because they're two. And the expectation would be, with continuing China-US conflict, that you would see Mexico and Central America, or the Pacific Alliance countries, which includes Chile and Colombia, getting more and more of this. But you would also see, and this has been very openly stated by a number of US tech multinationals, that they're going to also have a separate supply chain for the Chinese market. And so they may choose not to put that actually in China or only partly in China, but that will be mostly in countries that are more comfortable in their trade with China. Mm-hmm. So it's a mixed picture.
If you're one of these Latin American countries, or you're the prime minister or president, which could you exploit that and say, okay, I would like to bring certain industries in my country?
In my team's discussions with people from the region, they are thinking about that. And similarly, Thailand and Vietnam, and to a lesser degree, Indonesia, and some of the other countries in Southeast Asia are thinking about that. And so post-pandemic, you can imagine, and if the Biden administration was open to it, you could imagine sort of a creation of a trusted supplier, trusted worker zone with countries nearby with certain higher standards and security standards. And it's been, I don't want to say it's a huge disappointment, but it's been a little surprising to me how little the Biden economic team going in has mentioned these kinds of things and working more closely with Mexico, especially post-USMCA. I think there is some real possibility there. Another thing to be said is, pundits have always talked about the world dividing into blocks, in the 70s, and the 80s, and the 90s. Now, I think this is the time when the stopped clock may be right. That I'm hoping there isn't a major decoupling between the US and China. I don't think there will be. But particularly in the tech sector and in industrial products, I think there is going to be more of a divergence in blocks right now. That's what we're starting to see. It's more real than it's been at any time for decades. And the possibility then becomes that you have different standards as well that get reinforced by, say, US legislation about technology transfer. And then this gets back to some things like, if we have time, I'll get to, and which you mentioned at the start, which is Europe plays a key role here. Because does Europe decide to try to be multilateral and try to make it all stay open? Does it decide to ally with the US, in a sense, against China on certain technological issues and make one big block and another? Or does Europe go its own route because it has differences in standards and beliefs from the US and wants to have its own resilience? And I think that's the play for it in the next few years.
So to the extent you can forecast what the Biden administration wants, what vision do they have on these big questions?
I don't think they have a fully formed vision yet. I don't mean that as an insult. I don't think they have one. I think they have two elements they're committed to. One is closer relations with key allies, including Japan, EU, Australia, Canada, on tech, and trying to do more to exclude China. And the second is trying to reshore, in this process, trying to increase the amount that gets reshored to the US. I think the first value is something that on balance could be good if done properly. I think the second effort, as I've already indicated, is likely to fail. And so will they adapt it to then being reshoring to countries, lower income countries where production can be done, but which are in a more trusted relationship with the US? I think that's the direction they're going to end up, but they're not there yet. Let me just quickly point out, there's some really fascinating work done by my colleagues, Lee Brandsnyder and Brad Jensen, some of which those of you in the MBR networks are already aware of, about how US multinationals have been massively increasing their international teams on investment. They've been reciting where they put their hubs of R&D. Again, this goes with the story that it's not all one direction. Some of this globalization is increasing, and some of it is, in a sense, away from the US. Now, I would argue this is to the US and everyone's benefit, but the fact remains that we are seeing R&D moving abroad. And Reinhilde Vogler has some interesting work on this in the European context as well. Let me go quickly, try to go a little bit more quickly. There are, of course, trade agreements going on. Recently announced the RCEP, the Regional Cooperation, something partnership, which includes China, Japan, Korea, and others, is there. And it's actually a higher quality trade deal than many of us thought it might be. Higher quality in this case means it actually does bring down significant numbers of barriers. It's nothing to compare to CPTPP, which has very state-of-the-art standards and brings down a lot of barriers. But it is a meaningful trade deal. And so this, again, shows over time that the US, this is a chart from Peter Petrie, the US is sort of in this orbit with Canada and Mexico, but does this bilateral approach the Trump team took means that we're not in these overlapping trade deals in Asia. I don't view this as the end of the world, but I do think it's an important indicator about how the US is disengaged and how standards are being set and liberalization is taking place, not necessarily with the US involved, which is a mixed bag. Just a final note on the dollar, as Markus knows, most of my background is more as a macroeconomist than a trade economist. My colleague Joseph Gagnon has done a lot of work through the years on exchange rate intervention. And this is from his most recent publication. And he points out that there are a number of these small economies that are running very large amounts of net official flows, which is essentially a proxy for currency intervention. And to the degree that these are massively influencing the current account surpluses in countries. But what's important, I would take away from this, is notice that Japan's not on this list. China's not on this list. The only large economy on this list is Korea. And so we've had a world where there's been a successful agreement on avoiding currency manipulation, unilateral currency intervention between the largest economies. And that continues to be abided by. And so then also talking politically, there are people in the Congress and supporters of the Biden administration who would like to see very aggressive action taken by the US, for example, as the Trump administration just did against Vietnam on currency intervention. There are also people, and I would expect that Janet Yellen at running Treasury would be restrained in this, who would say we have criteria for deciding who's a currency manipulator. You generally have to do a lot to get labeled that. China isn't one right now and hasn't been. Japan isn't one right now and hasn't been. So is it worth the US bullying some of these countries? This again goes to the climate of how much the US wants to impose rules unilaterally versus not. But it's interesting that the dollar, which was seen as such a political hot point at various points in the recent decades, is not really one right now.
But could you say, with regard to the dollar, that the US will follow more a strong dollar or weak dollar policy going forward?
My expectation is it's going to be speak softly and keep a strong dollar, at least for the first couple of years. But there is a risk that there will be an uncoordinated response. So the Treasury will continue to say either strong dollar or say nothing, but not weaken the dollar. but people on the trade side at USTR, at Commerce, at State might try to do other things to retaliate against people they see as weakening the dollar. I mean, excuse me, as exploiting a strong dollar, excuse me. And so I think that, again, that's to play for. Larry Summers and Maury Obstfeld, who did memos for our project, the Peterson Institute, Rebuilding the Global Economy, in their advice to the Treasury Secretary and the Undersecretary Secretary of the Treasury, made it very clear they did not want to see a weakening of the dollar as a policy. Our colleague Joe Gagnon is making maybe not a weakening of the dollar, but an argument for a fairly valued dollar. So there is a debate out there. My expectation and my personal hope is, as long as it isn't China, Japan, EU, Euro area actively manipulating against the dollar, I think we shouldn't worry about it. But that's my personal view.
If smaller countries like Switzerland, that you don't have to worry about them in a sense.
Well, so what Joe might say, and others, frankly, close to the Biden administration might say is, well, supposedly we don't have to worry about it, but you start adding up all these small countries, Singapore, Norway, Switzerland, it actually adds up to a lot of money and therefore a lot of jobs for the US, and particularly if we're in a recession, whether it's due to the pandemic or not, there's a lot of unemployed people. And, so exchange rates actually do matter when you're below full employment as to what share of global jobs you get. There are different estimates of how much that matters, but that would be the kind of argument that would be made. You also have people like my predecessor at the Peterson Institute, Fred Bergsten, who would have argued in the past, well, maybe I don't want a weak dollar per se, but I'm worried that a strong dollar leads to protectionism in the Congress. This is the kind of argument Jim Baker made when he was Secretary of the Treasury negotiating the Plaza Accord in 1985. I'm a little less sympathetic to that for me personally, because I'm not sure pandering to Congress in the end necessarily is the right thing to do on some of these issues. But go ahead.
How do you see the interplay between the Treasury and the Fed on these dollar issues? Do you see a close collaboration between the two, or how will it, there are two players essentially from the US.
I think, unlike, say, the ECB and some other, the Bank of Japan, the Fed has very consciously taken a back seat on currency policy. I mean, in all these countries, in all these monetary zones, ultimately the currency policy is the reserve of the finance ministry or the treasury. But the ECB, the Bank of Japan, some of the other major central banks, perhaps as a result of Brexit, the Bank of England, we'll see, will get more active, have been more active on the currency management. The Fed has generally stayed way away from it, at least in public, and it generally only intervenes, as far as I know, only intervenes to support on the instruction of the Treasury. And I don't expect that to change. So let me try to wrap up. I think one of the things politically, when Markus says there are international things that become domestic, I think the tensions between the US and China are one of the biggest. And this is a place where it's interesting to think about what the Biden administration will do, because there was a dynamic in the campaign, overtaken, of course, by the pandemic, but about the idea that, do you soft on China, or are you not soft on China, and Trump and Biden trying to outbid each other. And so my way of thinking about it is that we've got three buckets of US-China relations. I put in the Pentagon bucket, there are issues of confrontation, like the treatment of Uyghurs and human rights, like the safety of Taiwan. I put in the green circular bucket issues of cooperation, green for climate change, for vaccines. And then in the middle, there are these economic issues that most of us work on this call, and which are the day-to-day back and forth between China and the US. And what happened under Trump was he focused solely on this middle bucket, and he completely ignored the other two. And what the Biden administration, it seems to be saying, if you read, for example, an article by Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell, to oversimplify, that they're going to massively increase the importance of both the confrontation and the cooperation buckets, but then try to use the economic integration bucket as a tool, particularly on the confrontation side. So they're going to mirror image, flip around the Trump approach. I'm hopeful for a better approach, which is that you do raise the issues of cooperation in a limited way, confrontation more than Trump did, but that you try to insulate the middle bucket, the economic bucket, and make it not a tool of statecraft. I think that that doesn't work and backfires, but this remains to be seen. More broadly, I think the Biden administration has made clear, and President-elect Biden's historical record in the Senate and as vice president is he is a believer in international cooperation. He is not instinctively against multilateralism. But I think we have to go in with realistic views about simultaneous common effort, about not some grandiose architecture for international cooperation. So Biden says he's going to treat allies as allies, and that is a necessary start to do anything. And Morris Obstfeld and I put out a briefing for the G20 with colleagues at Peterson back in the spring. And we talked about mutually binding and beneficial changes in government behavior. And this is really about simultaneous contributions to a common goal or a common agreement we're all not going to do X, currency manipulation. In this view, in my opinion, is a replacement for the view of the 70s and 80s where you had these deals, these international deals where you tried to say Germany does this and Japan expand their economy and the US contracts. These kinds of deals where people have different roles or sequence roles don't tend to be enforced and don't tend to be sustainable. And so when we think about successes in the financial crisis of a decade ago, we had the Vienna Initiative on credit in Eastern Europe. We had the G20 agreement not to engage in trade protectionism. We've had this lasting agreement on currency with China and the members of the G7. And we had the big success earlier this year on central bank swap lines. There are things in cooperation that if you're just saying everybody push in the same direction, everybody agree not to do something, that you can get cooperation through. But then the question is, and this goes back to Markus's framing it about Europe and not just Europe, about the members of CPTPP, about the people of Africa and of South Asia. What if the US or the People's Republic of China are unreliable partners after 2022 or 2024? You know, what happens if the election goes differently in 2024? And we have to recognize, and Markus, your co-author and your occasional co-author and Princeton colleague, Harold James, of course, has written a lot about this. You know, the degree of US adherence to international commitments we saw in the post-war period was historically pretty unusual. So we're back to this classic question of can we have international cooperation when the hegemon's not there, when there's conflict, when there's slow growth? And I think the answer is yes, but we have to build a system that's more modular, that's more resilient to withdrawal from or inconsistency from the US and China. And I've written an article about what I call principled plurilateralism. I won't belabor that at this point, but just to say, think in terms of Nordhaus's idea of clubs on climate, that you pick issues and you pick subsets of countries and you make those deals, and then over time, you accumulate more members and more deals. And we should take advantage of this political overemphasis on trade and heavy stuff made by macho men to make deals and make arrangements and progress on things like finance, like FDI, like immigration, like technology. And rather than doing these hot button issues, you mentioned your earlier talk you had in your series by Danny Roderick, who talks about different values in trade. And there are different values about food, and there are different values about cultural subsidies. But there are a lot of issues where those are not hot buttons, and the government should not be afraid to go on those. And they may be even more important than trade. And so just to advertise, Peterson Institute has put out what we call Rebuilding the Global Economy, an agenda with a list of policies that we would recommend the Biden administration, but also the European Commission, the international institutions talk about. I'll leave that here. Just let me conclude. I think if I'm talking to the Biden administration, which I am in a very indirect way, I think you can take advantage of some of the bad news. As they sing in Hamilton at Yorktown, the world is turned upside down. In COVID, countries and governments that we thought were incompetent have turned out to be much better at managing the disease than we expected, and countries like the US and UK have been much worse. Secular stagnation has changed the limits on the way we think about fiscal policy and reduced the risk of currency conflict because frankly, everybody's in this one integrated low interest rate environment. Economic nationalism, which is propped up in Trump, in Bolsonaro, in Orban, in Duterte, in all these places around the world, has shown very visibly its problems. And the Chinese Communist Party has overreached in various ways and alienated people it gave Belt and Road money to. And so there's a lot of bad news, but I think this gives an opportunity for the Biden administration to make deals, to question old assumptions, to deal with the world, and most importantly, for the rest of the world, the non-China, non-US world, to be more assertive and more constructive as they're already starting to be. So globalization isn't retreating or not, we're knitting it back together piece by piece, I think. Thank you for having me, Markus.
Thanks a lot, Adam. I have a few more questions I would like to throw at you. So one is the positive news. I think you have a very strong view that we will not enter in a second Cold War between China and US. Did I get this correctly? That's a very unlikely scenario. You didn't even mention this possibility.
I didn't mention it partly because I don't want to encourage it, but mostly because I don't think that's where we are. I mean, the Cold War, as colleagues of ours, both Princeton and PIE know, the Cold War had a lot of very genuine conflict in it. I mean, there were people getting killed in Central America, in Africa, and Southeast Asia through proxy armies. There were risks of nuclear encounters. There were horrible things going on. And there was a near complete economic division of the Soviet bloc from the US bloc. And I think we're a long way from all of those, even in this environment. I also just think the kinds of global threats, particularly the pandemic, recurrent pandemics, climate change, mean that we cannot have that kind of Cold War. And I do think the Biden administration and frankly, the Xi group recognize that.
So you mentioned very much, there's US, there's China, but the rest of the world, in a sense, can be an important player too, to build up a multilateral architecture. But what are the platforms they could use? Do you see particular platforms where they said that's where we come together and we think about it, they were throwing our weight in a sense? What channels do you see?
Yeah, it's a good question. So some people who follow this may have seen that as a parting shot, Ambassador Lighthizer, the soon-to-be former US trade representative, talked about how nobody missed the appellate body in the WTO for dispute settlement, and this thing that was set up around it was useless and ignored. And both statements are false. A lot of countries found the appellate body settling disputes very useful, including the US, frankly. And the move by a bunch of countries led by the European Union to set up essentially an appellate body minus the US, but able to do case settlement for disputes not involved in the US turned out to be very useful. And so that's an example. We saw recently that a number of the CPTPP countries like New Zealand and others stood up, Australia, Japan, stood up and said, we're going to allow for better free trade in medical supplies rather than cutting people off in the developing countries. And then that sort of encouraged the European Union to back off on some ill-considered bullying in that area. So there are examples of these kinds of things going on. And so part of my point is the big multilateral institutions are useful and should be supported, but most of the action is going to take place in these plurilateral smaller groupings. I think it's going to be more ad hoc.
So let me throw a final question, and then I give you the chance to end with a positive note. So we always end with a positive note in this webinar series. I would like to come back to this regional zones. So do you think there will be more trade in regional zones, or do you think we will stay in a globalized where it's the whole globe? What role do you think these regional zones will play? I mean, you had one slide on it, but perhaps you can elaborate on that.
Again, I think this is an area where there's good research to be done and people are doing it, including some of my colleagues, but including some of your colleagues and people you've had in the series. My speculative working hypothesis is that the regional zones will become more and more important for foreign direct investment, for setting of technological standards, for the building of educational and employment networks, that these zones will develop. but the trade per se is not going to be that interfered with. I think the volume and even the shape of trade will go on. It's actually more of these, frankly, more important things, although smaller scale and less visible, is where we're going to see more of the separation into zones.
And the positive note? The
positive note is, for all and everything, the Biden administration does clearly not view the possibility of international cooperation as real, beneficial, and knows that there are these existential, and I use the word consciously, threats of pandemic and climate change and political upheaval due to injustice and conflict. And that is a good thing. And the way that the rest of the world, starting with the EU, but with many other countries, are receiving the news that at least for 4 years, the US will try to be a constructive partner, is also a very positive thing. So I think we are primed to have a better next 4 years.
I like the positive news, just the 4-year emphasis is a little bit worrisome. So thanks a lot, Adam. It was great to have you, and we stay in touch and talk to each other soon.
And thank you for having me, Markus, and thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.